Boston sports fans, so we'll get that out of the way. So what I want to talk to you about is that recently in the past few years, Microsoft has significantly improved the login capabilities with Microsoft Sysmon and PowerShell to provide that visibility to see what an attacker, what an adversary or malicious insider is doing. By increasing the logging levels, though, sometimes we create a new risk to the environment that sometimes we might not be aware of. This could be done by a sysadmin, a developer, or even sometimes a third-party application. And I want to raise some of that awareness to you today. So with a quick show of hands, who is logging Sysmon or PowerShell? Who's in the process of looking at it? All right, so a little bit of a mix. So for those of you that may already have Sysmon or PowerShell login, maybe you've seen some of these things. And if you haven't, certainly, hopefully, maybe you can go back to your environment and see if these are some of the things that you're seeing in your login solution. So quick overview. Again, this isn't going to be talking about how to configure Sysmon. It's just a quick overview of what Sysmon is. So it's a Microsoft Sysmon internals tool that monitors system activity to the event log. There's a configuration where you can include or exclude certain things, such as process information, registry changes, network connections, things like that. You can get pretty granular where you can exclude certain things like the source process that's calling another process. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another option for configuration, if you're doing Windows event log forwarding and collection, you have the ability to do like an XPath filter to exclude certain things that you might not want to get sent to your central SIM or to the Windows event log collector itself. Recently, they added DNS logging with version 10. This is huge. Really, we can see that where the application is making that network connection to. Prior to that, you look at, say, your proxy logs, but you really didn't have a way of identifying what the application was that was making that network request. And the biggest thing, we have the ability to forward these logs to SIM or to a Windows event log collector. PowerShell login. There's a lot here. So we got the PowerShell history logs, the PS3 line logs, the PowerShell script block logging, PowerShell module logging, the transcript logs, and then the most important thing, we want to make sure we're on version 5 in order to get the most logging capabilities. So real quick, again, this isn't really to go over how to configure it, but the best way is through group policy. As you see, we have a few options. This is what's configured on the test machine that I was using. And just a few options. So we've got the PowerShell script block logging. You have the option to enable invocation start stops. That gets pretty chatty, so as you see on the left-hand side, you might want to start with it turned off and then try to see what that log volume is before you turn it on. On the right-hand side, we've got the PowerShell transcript logs. The important thing here is that you want to specify where the path is that the transcript logs are going to go to. So transcript logs, pretty much, it's like somebody's transcripting everything that you're doing. A lot of great visibility as to what somebody's doing. But again, creates a potential risk, and we can go over that. And this is what the PowerShell transcript block logging looks like. So in this case, it gives us a lot of helpful information. We can see the user context that it was run from, what the machine was, and then the commands that were actually run. So in this case, it was just a simple write host hello, and we can see that down on the bottom. And then with the PowerShell script log login, this is where it actually gets logged directly to the event log. So again, if you want to consume these logs, you can consume these logs using native Windows event log forwarding to a collector, or if you have your SIM has an agent, you can deploy the agent and then consume it into your SIM. All right, so what's the problem? We're collecting all this information. It's great. We want to see what what malware is doing. We want to see what our devs are doing. We want to see what our sysadmins are doing. But what happens when they've got scripts and passwords are configured? Passwords are being used in the scripts. I want to show a few recent examples that we've seen in our environment where passwords were being exposed in the event log that allowed potentially somebody to compromise or gain access to accounts that they shouldn't. So in this case, this was actually a Black Hills pen test that was done in our environment. Might be a little hard to see, but the tool's Mail Sniper. And what Mail Sniper does is it looks for, there's a few different things that it does, but in this case, the pen tester, they was trying to harvest all the email addresses in our environment so they could do a password spray. As we can see with the script, they're passing the username and they're passing the password. The problem with this with PowerShell logging enabled, now we have access to that password. And so I'll show you what that looks like. So this is the transcript log. And as you can see, we can see that they ran the invoke global mail search. They had the username, and then they had the password. In this case, everyone's favorite, summer 19. And so it made it very easy for us. Now, we didn't have access to that box, but we had access to the logs. Now we can connect to that box, and we can potentially see what other sensitive information they have on that machine. So now we can see what their targets were, what information they found, so on. So if in the case where it's a red team assessment, and they're trying to be a little stealthy, we could potentially see what their next target is. The next one. So this one is the PowerShell command line history logs. So similar to like bash history logs. So what's the problem here? So in this example, we had PowerShell command line history logging enabled on all machines. And when we had it enabled for security administrators, the ones that are creating the accounts, we basically had every username and password that was created from new AD user stored on our SIM. So if you think about, from a security administration standpoint, sometimes they might be onboarding accounts 2 weeks prior to the person starting. So there's potentially a 2-week opportunity where an attacker could gain access to these accounts that's stored in the local event log or stored in the SIM, and they would potentially be able to use these accounts. Depending on the account, they might be privileged, they might have access to sensitive information that they'd be able to have exposure to. And one interesting thing here, so Bo, who developed Mail Sniper, he also developed a tool called check local admin hash. And what that tool is actually doing is it's exfiltrating the PS readline files. So this same file here, that's basically what he's doing to exfiltrate and then potentially gain access to credentials like what we see here. This is another example. So this was a server administrator who was trying to run a remote task on a separate workstation. So same thing, he was just running scheduled tasks. He was specifying the username and the password on the workstation, and then the task that he was running. So again, it was very easy where now all of a sudden, think of a privileged account that has access to all servers. Now potentially me as a security professional, now I have access to these servers that I potentially shouldn't have access to. And just another example here. So this one was actually a third-party application, which basically makes WMI calls to try to get information and then provide that information back. So similar to like SCCM as an example. So in this case, it was actually using an account, and again, same thing, it had the username and password, and now this was a very privileged account that we had access to in their environment. So great, we identified what the problem is. How do we remediate this? Well, there's a few different things that we can do. So the first thing we could do, locally on a machine, we could do get when event, and we could look for certain processes that we know pass username and password. We could search our SIM for common processes passing the passwords. We could also use Conza. If anybody's heard of Conza before, it's an incident response framework developed on PowerShell where you could develop a module and look for passwords or other indicators. I'll show you a Conza module I developed that will help identify some of the passwords. Identify what your acceptable risk is to disable or modify logging. So again, maybe you want to have this enabled on, say, a human resource machine, but you might not want to have it on your security administrator's machine who's actually creating these user accounts and has all the username and password stored. You could also modify the Sysmon configuration file. So as an example, you might modify the configuration file. So yeah, you want to see when things like net use commands and so on are being used with username username and password, but you potentially might want to exclude what that source process name is. So as an example, if you have SCCM that's calling net use to change the local admin password as an example, you could exclude the source parent process of SCCM with a child process of net use or net.exe. Leverage static code analysis. So if we go back to that Mail Sniper, using static code analysis to identify potentially scripts that might have passwords that would be exposed. Educate sysadmins and developers, and protected event logging. And we'll talk about protected event logging for those of you that might not have heard of it. So the Conza module. So very simple, what it basically is a regex that's looking for some of the common processes that are specifying the username and password. So PSExec, WMI, net use, schedule task, task list, task kill, just to name a few. So as we can see in all these examples, it's specifying the username and password. It's got those, it's got that parameter. I'll show you what that looks like run on a test machine that I was doing. So with it run, what it will do is it will look at the event log, and it's basically doing the regex, looking for some of those common username and passwords. So in the first example, we can see that it was psexec, I was connecting to a remote machine, and I was specifying the username and password. So very easy, it identifies what the process is, and it actually shows me the command line. Now I can go to that, say, sysadmin, and I could say, should we be using psexec, or potentially, do you even need to specify the username and the password in the first place, right? Maybe you don't. Maybe you already have access to that box. You don't have to specify the username and password. Maybe there's a better option. So PS session might be another or better option. And then the second one was when net was being run, and what this was doing is it was creating a local account on the machine. So same thing, it's identifying the user that was created, and then what the password is. Sigma. If any of you have heard of Sigma, this is a Sigma rule. Basically what Sigma is, it's a generic signature format for SIM systems, and allows you to use Sigmac to export this rule and then run queries. It supports a lot of the common SIMs such as ArcSight, Graylog, Splunk, to name a few. And so what you can do is you can export this rule, and it will run a query. Again, same thing. It's basically doing the regex matches, looking for a common process that has username and password. And PS Script Analyzer. So what this does is static code analysis on PowerShell scripts, and it has a few different rules. Specifically, the ones that we're interested in is the avoid username and passwords rule, and then avoid using plain text for passwords. And I'll show you what that looks like on that Mail Sniper script that we looked at earlier. So what we'll do is with PS Script Analyzer, we'll do invoke Script Analyzer, include rules. If we don't do include rules, it's basically going to use all the rules, and then we're going to get potentially all the different potential best practices around the script. In this case, we're really only focused on trying to identify passwords that might be in the script. So the rule that we're using is the PS avoid using plain text for password, pointed to Mail Sniper, and as we can see, it's identified that the password should use secure string. And what this would do is this would prevent it from being stored in the event log. All right, on to the silver bullet. So with Windows 10, Microsoft implemented protected event logging. So what this does is it will decrypt, it will encrypt the events stored on disk, and then it allows the events to be decrypted. So a public key installed on all workstations, and then you have a private key to decrypt the event log. The biggest problem that you have with this is a lot of SIM vendors don't currently support this today. So it's great, it's encrypted locally on the workstation. Well, how do you actually view the information in your SIM? So the biggest thing here is that it requires Windows 10, and then I'd really check with your SIM vendor to see whether or not they support this. And if they don't, work with them to see how they can support this, because what this will do is, again, same thing, if these username and passwords are stored locally on disk. Think of the example that I used with, it was making the WIMI calls on all workstations and getting process information. If I looked at my event log, now all of a sudden I had that sensitive account. If I didn't have access to view that information because the information is encrypted on disk, I don't have access to that account. And last slide, just a few references. There's a really good article about PowerShell for the Blue Team. So that talks about a lot of the different PowerShell logging options that, again, we just kind of glanced at real quickly here. Really wanted to talk about potentially the exposure of enabling all these event logs. But the PowerShell for the Blue Team is a really great resource to understand all the different logging levels, maybe what you want to enable, what you don't want to enable. PS Script Analyzer, again, that's the static code analysis. Black Hills put a really good webcast about enabling Sysmon. I'd recommend watching that. And then one that's really important is Sysmon tampering. So there's a really good article that was put out regarding tampering, protecting Sysmon logging. So making sure that somebody doesn't change the configuration on you. Make sure that they're not doing other things that would prevent Sysmon from accurately logging and having the ability to get that visibility on the workstation. And then lastly, securing your PowerShell operational logs. So that was a really good article from Microsoft. And then the protected event logging. So additional information, how to get that enabled in your environment. On my Medium site, I'll have the slides posted for those of you that are interested. And that's it. Any questions? Yeah, so the Windows event log, so if you're doing native Windows event log forwarding and collecting, you'd have the ability within the Windows event log collected to decrypt it there and then ship it out to a SIM. But if you're using something like an agent locally on a workstation, it likely doesn't have the ability to decrypt those logs, and then that's where you run into the issue. Yep. Think we good? I'm sorry, what's that? Yeah, another great resource I didn't put on here is, I think most of you that looked at Sysmon, and I know it's talked about in the webinar with Black Hills, Swift on Security is a great resource for having a configuration file for Sysmon that is already including or excluding a lot of the events that you're interested in. So a lot of the chatty stuff that you're probably not going to gain too much information from is excluded, and then it also has the inclusions. I'd say use it as a starting template, and then based on your environment, you're probably going to exclude or include certain things specific to your environment. They recently mapped it to the MITRE framework, yeah, which is great. Yep.
Cool if you're mapping out. Yeah.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. All right, thank you.